Before you watch another second of this, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Because what happened next in this story is the reason half of London stopped speaking to the Duke of Evermery for the rest of his life. "You have made your choice," she told him, her voice so calm it frightened the footman standing frozen in the corridor, "and by morning, so shall I." He laughed at her. He actually laughed, standing there in his shirt-sleeves with his mistress's hand still warm from the weight of the family tiara he had just placed in it. He did not know, not yet, what a woman who has been humiliated in silence for 6 years is capable of once she decides silence is no longer required of her. Stay until the end. Because when the truth finally came out in front of all of society, not one person in that ballroom was breathing. Iloin Evermery had not always been a duchess, though by the time this story begins she had worn the title so long that most people forgot she had ever been anything else. She had been born the youngest daughter of a baronet with more pride than money, raised in a draughty house in Kent, where the fires were banked early to save coal, and the good silver was polished only when guests were expected, which was rarely. She had married Julian Evermery for reasons that seemed, at 19, entirely sufficient. He was handsome in the careless way of men who have never had to try. He was heir to one of the oldest dukedoms in England, and he had looked at her. In the one season she was permitted a London wardrobe as though she were the only woman in the room. She had believed, in the foolish and forgivable way of the very young, that being chosen was the same thing as being loved. It took her the better part of 6 years of marriage to understand that these were not the same thing at all, and that a man could choose a woman for her bloodline, her fortune, or the shape of her mouth, and never once choose to know her. She remembered still, with the particular clarity reserved for the moments that quietly determine the shape of a life, the morning her father had informed her over a cold breakfast that the Duke of Evermery had asked for her hand, and the way her sisters had gone silent with envy while she herself had felt only a small private thrill of disbelief, as though the world had made an error in her favour that no one had yet noticed enough to correct. She had gone to her wedding in a gown remade from her mother's, because there had been no funds for new silk, and had stood before 400 years of Evermery ancestors in oil paint feeling, for the first time in her life, that she might finally belong somewhere grand enough to matter. The Dowager Duchess had placed the family tiara upon her head with her own hands that morning, murmuring that it had been worn by every bride who had ever properly loved this family. And Iloin, not yet 20 and entirely unschooled in the difference between being loved and being merely useful, had believed her completely. The Evermery estate was a magnificent, freezing museum of a house, all marble and portraiture and the accumulated disapproval of 400 years of ancestors staring down from gilt frames. Iloin moved through it like a competent and increasingly invisible curator. She managed the household accounts with a precision the previous Duchess had never bothered to develop. She corresponded with tenants whose roofs leaked and whose children were sick, and saw to it, quietly and without asking her husband's permission, that coal and physicians reached them before Christmas. She read every book in the Evermery library that had not already been read to her as a bedtime story, because there was little else to do in the long hours when Julian was in London on business he did not discuss, or in the country on hunting parties to which wives were not invited. She had grown very good at being alone in a house full of servants, She had grown very good, too, at not asking questions whose answers she suspected she did not want. The suspicion had a name, eventually, and the name was Camilla Vane. Lady Vane was a widow of considerable beauty and considerably less fortune. The kind of woman society tolerated at the edges of every gathering because she was amusing and well-dressed and posed no threat to anyone's husband, or so everyone had assumed. Eloan had first noticed her at a dinner party 18 months into the trouble, had watched the particular way Julian's attention settled on Lady Vane across a table of 30 guests, and did not wander, and had felt something cold slide into place in her chest that she did not yet have a word for. She did not confront him. She was, by then, a woman who had learned that confrontation without proof only won her the reputation of a jealous, tiresome wife, while the husband in question suffered no such cost at all. So she watched. She kept a small, private ledger of her own, not of money but of moments, the nights he claimed business and came home smelling of a perfume that was not the one she wore, the letters that arrived for him in a hand she did not recognize and that he burned rather than left lying about, the sudden trips to town that coincided always with Lady Vane's own departures from the country. It was Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, who had been at Avemery Hall since before Julian was born, who first said the thing aloud that Eloan had not permitted herself to think in full sentences. "Your Grace," the old woman said one evening, setting down the tea-tray with hands that trembled slightly now, though her voice did not, "I have served 3 duchesses in this house, and I will not stand by and watch a 4th one made a fool of in her own home." Eloan had asked her, very quietly, what she meant, and Mrs. Fenwick had told her about the rooms prepared in the London house that the Duchess was never meant to see, about the jeweller's boy who had come to the back door twice that month with parcels addressed to no one in particular, about the way the senior footman, a loyal boy named Thomas, had gone pale when asked directly whether his master had entertained a lady at the townhouse in his wife's absence. Eloan had thanked her, and had gone up to her rooms and had sat very still for a long time before she cried, because she had promised herself years ago that she would not give Julian Avemery the satisfaction of her tears even when he was not there to see them. It was into this quiet, accumulating catalogue of evidence that the tiara arrived, or rather, that the tiara left. The Avemery tiara was not merely jewellery. It was history set in diamonds and old gold, worn by every Duchess of Avemery back to the reign of the second George, a piece so entwined with the family's identity that it appeared in half the portraits lining the long gallery, resting on the brows of women 3, 4, 5 generations dead. It had been placed on Eloan's own head at her wedding by Julian's mother, the Dowager Duchess, with a ceremony that felt at the time like being welcomed properly into a family at last. It sat now in a locked case in the estate's strong room, brought out only for the grandest occasions, and it was, by law and by custom and by every unspoken rule of the aristocracy, not a possession to be given away. It belonged to the title. It belonged, in the particular and possessive way these things worked, to whichever woman currently held the name of Duchess of Avemery. It did not belong to Julian to give to anyone at all. She found them, by accident, or by the kind of accident that is really the last link in a long chain of quiet vigilance. She had come down to the estate office, unannounced on a Tuesday evening, meaning only to fetch a ledger she had left there, moving in the soft-soled slippers she wore in the evening that made no sound on the stone floors of the old wing. The door to the muniment room, where the strongbox lived, stood ajar, and lamplight spilled from it into the dark corridor, and she heard, before she saw, her husband's voice, low and warm in a register she had not heard directed at her in years. "It suits you better than it ever suited her," he was saying, and Eloan stopped walking, her hand flat against the cold stone wall, and looked through the gap in the door. Julian stood with his back half to her, his shirt sleeves rolled, his cravat loosened in the careless way he wore it only when he believed himself unobserved. In his hands, catching the lamplight in 100 small fires, was the Avamiri tiara. And Lady Camilla Vane stood before him in a travelling cloak, her hair already dressed as though in anticipation, her eyes bright with the particular greed of a woman who has just been promised something she has wanted for a very long time. Eloan watched her husband lift the tiara and set it, with a tenderness she had not received from him since their wedding night, upon another woman's head. "There," Julian said softly, stepping back to admire the effect. "Now you look the part." The lamplight caught the diamonds and threw small trembling stars across the ceiling, across the dark wood panelling, across Lady Vane's flushed and delighted face, and for a moment Eloan was aware of nothing so much as the absurd, almost comic ordinariness of it all, that betrayal, when it finally revealed itself after 6 years of careful suspicion, should look exactly like a man admiring a woman in fine jewellery. The same small domestic tableau that might have played out once between Eloan and Julian themselves in the earliest and most hopeful days of their marriage. She thought of her own wedding morning, the Dowager Duchess's hands settling that very tiara onto her own young head, the promise that it belonged to whichever woman properly loved this family. She wondered, with a coldness that surprised her, whether Julian even remembered making that same claim to her once, in nearly the same words he was now offering to another woman entirely. Eloan did not gasp. She did not cry out or drop the ledger she carried or do any of the things a lesser telling of this story might have her do. She stood very still in the dark corridor and felt, with a kind of terrible clarity, 6 years of careful blindness burn away at once, and in its place came something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but a cold, clean resolve she had never before had cause to feel in full. She stepped into the doorway. "Julian," she said, and her voice was so level that both of them startled as though a ghost had spoken. "You forget yourself. That tiara is not yours to bestow." Lady Vane's hand flew to her own head as though the diamonds had suddenly grown hot. Julian's face went through several rapid transformations, alarm, then a kind of oiled charm he reached for out of long habit, then, when he saw that charm was doing nothing at all to the expression on his wife's face, something closer to irritation. "Eloan, this is not what it appears. It is precisely what it appears," she said. "You have made your choice, and by morning so shall I." He laughed then, that same careless laugh she had once mistaken for warmth, certain, as men like Julian always are, that whatever storm he had caused would blow itself out by breakfast, that his wife's pride would bend the way it always had. He did not yet understand that he had just handed her, along with the tiara he had temporarily lost control of, the last piece of proof she needed, and the last of her patience besides. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead at the small writing desk in her private sitting room and composed a letter, not to her husband, but to Mr. Aldous Whitmore, the family's long-time jeweller in London, A man who had served 3 generations of Avamere duchesses, and who, she suspected correctly, would recognize an instruction from the current one as binding regardless of what any man in the house might say to the contrary. She instructed him to send his most discreet and most trusted craftsman to Avamere Hall by the first light of morning, prepared to melt down and entirely reforge. At her express direction, and her express direction alone, every stone and every ounce of gold in the ducal tiara. She did not sign the letter as Julian's wife. She signed it, for the first time in 6 years, simply as the Duchess of Evermery, as though the title had only just become entirely her own. The one person she summoned before the letter was sent was Lord Alaric Penrose, who had known her since they were children racing ponies across the same stretch of Kentish field, before he had gone off to study the law and she had gone off to marry a duke, and whose friendship had survived quietly and without comment from either of them every year and every distance since. He arrived at dawn, his coat still damp from riding through the last hour of darkness, and found her in the estate office with the lamp still burning and the tiara sitting on the desk before her like a small glittering accusation. "I need a solicitor," she told him, without preamble, "and I need a friend, and I am hoping very much you can be both before this day is finished." He looked at the tiara, and at the ledger open beside it, filled with her small, careful notations of dates and names and sums, and something in his face, which had always, if she was honest with herself, held a warmth for her that had nothing to do with duty, settled into a grim and steady resolve. "Tell me everything," he said from the beginning. And she did, for the first time speaking aloud all 6 years of what she had endured and observed and quietly recorded, and when she finished, the sky outside had gone from black to grey to the pale gold of an actual morning, and Mr. Whitmore's craftsman was already at the door with his travelling forge, waiting on the Duchess's instruction. What Alaric brought to the matter, beyond friendship, was the particular skill of a man who had spent a decade untangling the finances of families far more tangled than most people suspected their own to be. And it was he who first noticed, reading through Eloin's careful ledger of dates and sums with a barrister's eye rather than a wife's, that the pattern of Julian's spending did not add up to a man simply keeping a mistress in comfort. The sums leaving the estate accounts were too large, too regular, and routed through channels that had nothing to do with Lady Vane's household at all. "Your husband is either the most extravagant fool in England," Alaric said slowly, turning a page, "or someone is bleeding this estate dry and using his indiscretion as a very convenient screen to hide behind." Eloin felt the cold resolve in her chest turn for the first time towards something more like dread, because she understood at once who that someone was likely to be. Silas Crane was Julian's cousin, a poor relation given the position of estate steward some 4 years prior out of a duke's careless generosity, and never once seriously supervised since, because Julian had never in his life supervised anything he could avoid supervising. Eloin had never liked him. There was a smoothness to Silas Crane, an eagerness to please that curdled, when observed closely enough, into something closer to calculation. But she had had no cause, until now, to suspect him of more than an unpleasant manner. Alaric spent 3 days going quietly through the estate's books with Mrs. Fenwick's help and the reluctant cooperation of a young underclerk named Peters, who had grown uneasy enough about certain entries to keep his own private notes. And what emerged was a scheme both simple and audacious, Rents collected from tenants and recorded as paid to the estate had been diverted, in small and carefully staggered amounts over nearly 3 years, into accounts Silas Crane controlled under a false name, while forged receipts and doctored ledgers kept the fraud invisible to a duke who never once thought to check his own steward's arithmetic. Lady Vane, it further emerged from letters Peters had glimpsed, and Mrs. Fenwick had overheard discussed between mistress and steward at a dinner Julian had not known his housekeeper was serving. Was not merely Julian's mistress, but Silas Crane's own cousin on her mother's side, installed in Julian's affections in no small part to keep his attention thoroughly occupied elsewhere, while the estate's money quietly disappeared beneath him. Eloan sat with this discovery for a long while in the cold light of the estate office, the reforged Tiara. For Mr. Whitmore's craftsman had by then already begun his work in a locked room down the hall, the old setting being carefully broken apart under her personal supervision, glinting in pieces on a velvet cloth before her. She had expected when she began to be fighting a husband's betrayal. She understood now that she was fighting 2 betrayals wound together, one of the heart and one of the ledger, and that the second was very likely the one that would end in a courtroom rather than merely a scandal. "We will need everything," Alaric told her. "Testimony, receipts, the forged entries themselves, and we will need it before Crane realizes we are looking, because a man who has stolen this cleverly for this long will not hesitate to burn the evidence the moment he suspects discovery." Eloan looked at the pieces of the old tiara being weighed and catalogued before her, gold that had adorned 5 duchesses now waiting to become something entirely her own, and thought that she had already burned enough of her old life for 1 week. What remained now was simply the work of building carefully, evidence by evidence, the fire that would burn everything Julian and his cousin had built instead. Word of the tiara reached Julian before noon, carried inevitably by a housemaid too frightened of her master's temper to disobey his demand to know where his wife had gone at such an hour and what she had taken with her. He came storming into the estate office to find his wife calmly directing Mr. Whitmore's craftsman in the careful weighing of diamonds that no longer sat in any recognizable setting at all, and for the first time in the marriage, Eloan watched real fear cross her husband's face rather than mere irritation. "Do you understand what you have done?" he demanded. "That tiara is 4 generations of this family's history it was," Eloan agreed, not looking up from the ledger she was annotating. 4 generations of this family's history that you attempted to hand to your mistress as though it were a trinket from a market stall. I have simply ensured it will never be used to dress another man's indiscretion again." He tried threats next. He would have her removed from the house. He would write to her father. He would see her confined to the dower house for the impertinence, and Eloan let him exhaust himself entirely before she answered, in the same level voice she had used the night before. "You may try any of those things, Julian, and I will meet each one with a solicitor and a magistrate, because I have spent 6 years being a patient and obedient wife, while you were neither patient nor faithful in return, and that particular arrangement has now concluded." It was the first time in the marriage she had spoken to him as an equal rather than a supplicant, and the shock of it, more than anything else, was what finally silenced him. He left the estate office without another word, and Eloan heard, some hours later, the sound of his horse being saddled in a temper and ridden hard down the drive toward London, and she understood, watching from the window of her sitting-room, that he had gone either to Lady Vane or to whatever solicitor would tell him what he most wished to hear, and that either way. The conversation between them was very far from finished. He did not remain silent for long. Within the week, Julian and Silas Crane together attempted a counterstroke of their own, whispering carefully to the right ears in society that the Duchess of Avermery had suffered a nervous collapse, that grief over a difficult marriage had unsettled her mind, that the melting of a family heirloom was proof enough of instability that ought to concern anyone who cared for the family's good name. Eloin learned of the rumour from Mrs. Fenwick, who had it from a cousin in service at the house of one of the worst gossips in London, and felt the particular specific fury of a wronged woman watching her own reasonable conduct twisted into the very madness her husband's infidelity had nearly driven her to. "They mean to have me declared unfit," she told Alaric that evening, "so that whatever I uncover about Crane's theft can be dismissed as the ravings of a woman out of her senses, and whatever I do about Julian's conduct can be quietly buried along with my reputation." Alaric's jaw tightened in a way she had rarely seen in the mild, careful man she had known since childhood. "Then we will simply have to ensure," he said, "that when the truth is finally told, it is told so publicly and so completely that no one in London can pretend afterward they did not hear it clearly." The dark hour, when it came, arrived in the form of a letter from Julian's own solicitor, not Alaric, but the family's long-time man, loyal to the Duke rather than the Duchess, informing Eloin that the Duke intended to petition for a formal separation on grounds of her erratic conduct, that she would be expected to remove herself to the Dower House pending the matter's resolution, and that her access to the estate accounts, the very records that held the proof of Crane's theft, would be suspended immediately. For one long night, sitting alone with that letter in her hands, Eloin allowed herself to feel the full weight of how close she had come to losing everything at once: her home, her standing, her proof, and very nearly her own certainty that she had not, in fact, imagined the whole of it. She thought, in the darkest part of that night, of her own mother, who had endured a marriage of similar quiet neglect, and had never once, in Eloin's memory, raised her voice about it. And she wondered whether she was about to prove herself no braver than that example after all, whether 6 years of careful ledgers and quiet observation would end simply with her removed to a cold Dower House too, grow old alone while Julian and his cousin continued exactly as before. It was a bleak thought, and she allowed herself perhaps 20 minutes of it before something in her, the same something that had kept her recording dates and sums for 18 months without ever quite admitting to herself why, refused to permit her to remain there any longer. It was Mrs. Fenwick who found her at 2 in the morning, still dressed, still sitting upright at her desk, and who did not offer comfort so much as resolve. "I have kept this house's secrets and its honesty both for 30 years, your grace," the old woman said, "and I did not do it so that a thief and a liar could frighten the one Duchess in my memory who ever deserved the title into silence. Whatever you need from me, and from every servant in this house who still has their wits about them, you shall have it before the sun is up." What followed was 4 days of quiet, methodical work that Eloin would later think of as the truest campaign of her life. Alaric secured sworn statements from the young clerk Peters, whose conscience, once properly appealed to, produced not only testimony but the original ledger pages Crane had believed destroyed. kept safely copied against just such a day of reckoning. Mrs. Fenwick gathered the household staff one by one in the privacy of the servants' hall, and found among them no fewer than 6 who had witnessed some piece of the deception first-hand. A groom who had driven Lady Vane to meetings with Crane she claimed to Julian were social calls upon her own family. A laundress who had found and preserved, rather than destroyed, a letter from Crane to Vane discussing the arrangement in terms no innocent correspondence would use, the footman Thomas, whose pale confirmation weeks earlier now became a full and detailed account. Eloan herself rode out personally to 3 tenant farms whose rents Crane had claimed were in arrears despite having been paid in full, and returned with receipts the tenants had wisely kept and Crane had never thought to ask for back. Eloan herself sat with the laundress, a quiet young woman named Bess, who had nearly burned the incriminating letter twice out of fear before her conscience got the better of her, and listened as Bess described, hands twisting in her apron. How she had found it tucked inside a gown sent down for cleaning, and had known at once, from the familiarity of the language within it, that it was not the correspondence of 2 people who considered themselves merely cousins. "I did not know what to do with it, Your Grace," Bess admitted, "for I did not wish to be the one who ruined a great house, nor did I wish to serve in one built on a lie." Eloan took the girl's hands in her own, an intimacy no Duchess before her would have thought to offer a laundress, and told her with complete sincerity that she had done nothing but the right thing, and that no harm would come to her for it. It was a small moment, and it cost Eloan nothing, but she noticed, in the days that followed, how much more readily the rest of the household staff came forward once word of it had quietly spread below stairs. Piece by piece, the case assembled itself the way the reforged Tiara had assembled itself in Whitmore's workshop, old material, broken down and reordered into something with an entirely new shape and an entirely new purpose, no longer a symbol of a marriage, but a weapon in the hands of the woman that marriage had wronged. The reckoning came, as these things so often did in that world, at a ball, the Avamere Midsummer Ball, an event so old and so central to the family's standing that Julian could not have cancelled it without inviting the very speculation he was trying to avoid, and so it proceeded exactly as planned. 300 of society's most prominent families gathered beneath the ballroom's restored chandeliers, entirely unaware that the evening had been chosen, deliberately and precisely, by the Duchess herself as the stage for her husband's undoing. Eloan entered the ballroom on Alaric's arm rather than Julian's, a breach of custom that sent a ripple of whispered speculation through the room before she had even crossed the threshold, and upon her brow, catching the candlelight in 100 small fires exactly as the old Tiara once had, sat its successor, reforged from the very same gold and the very same diamonds, but reset now in a pattern entirely of her own design. A phoenix rising through a circlet of stars, unmistakably new, unmistakably hers, and unmistakably a message to every person watching that whatever had been broken in this house had been remade rather than mended. Julian found her within the hour, his face carefully composed for the benefit of the watching room, but his eyes furious beneath the composure. "You will humiliate us both," he hissed, low enough that only she could hear it. "I am not the one who arranged the humiliation," Eloan answered, and then, raising her voice only slightly, just enough that the nearest cluster of guests turned their heads, added, Though I confess I did arrange this evening's entertainment rather carefully, Julian, and I think you will find it very thoroughly attended to." She nodded, and across the ballroom Alaric stepped forward with a folder of papers in hand, and Peters the clerk, dressed carefully in his best coat and visibly trembling but resolute, moved to stand beside him. And the room's low hum of conversation began, gradually and then all at once, to falter into silence as 300 guests realized something was happening that was not on the evening's program. Alaric did not raise his voice either, but the silence in the room by then was so complete that he did not need to. He spoke of estate rents diverted over 3 years, of forged ledgers and a false name behind which stolen sums had been quietly gathered, of a steward who had used his own cousin's presence in the Duke's affections as cover for theft neither Julian nor society had thought to question. Peters confirmed each figure with the quiet, devastating specificity of a man who had kept his own records precisely because he had suspected this day might come. Mrs. Fenwick, standing near the door with the composure of 30 years' service, confirmed what the household staff had witnessed, and were, every one of them, prepared to swear to before any magistrate who asked. And when Silas Crane, white-faced and already edging toward the ballroom's side door, made to slip away into the night, it was Thomas, the footman, stationed there at Eloan's own quiet instruction, who blocked his path long enough for 2 constables, summoned by Alaric that very afternoon and waiting, at Eloan's request, just beyond the terrace, to take him properly into custody before the eyes of every guest in the room. Lady Vane's exposure required no constables at all. It required only the sight of her own cousin being led away in irons, and the collective icy silence of 300 people who had until that moment received her at their own tables, to accomplish what no legal proceeding could have. She left the ballroom that night on no one's arm, her carriage called for her by a footman who did not trouble to hide his contempt, and she was not received in a respectable house in London again for the whole of that decade. Julian, for his part, was left standing in the centre of his own ballroom, with nowhere to direct his fury, and no one left willing to receive it. His cousin under arrest, his mistress fled, his household staff having testified openly against the household's thefts, and his wife standing composed and untouchable beside a barrister and friend whose loyalty to her had, in the space of a fortnight, become the talk of every drawing-room in London for reasons entirely more flattering than the rumours Julian had tried to spread about her sanity. The Dowager Duchess herself, Julian's own mother, was heard to remark to a cluster of stunned matrons near the punch table that she had always known her daughter-in-law was worth 10 of her son, and that she, for one, did not intend to pretend otherwise a moment longer, now that the whole room had been given such thorough occasion to agree with her. It was, several guests would say for years afterward, the single most talked about evening London society had produced in a decade, and every one of them would claim, whether truthfully or not, to have been standing close enough to see the Duchess's face when the constables led Silas Crane away. The separation proceeded, after all, though on terms entirely reversed from those Julian's solicitor had first proposed. It was Julian who removed to a smaller property, while Eloan retained Avamere Hall and the greater part of its income. The settlement negotiated by Alaric with a thoroughness that left Julian's own solicitor privately admitting, to anyone who would listen, that the Duke had been thoroughly and deservedly outmanoeuvred. Silas Crane was tried and convicted of fraud within the year. His sentence, a matter of public record and public satisfaction among the tenants whose rents he had stolen and who found themselves, under Eloan's sole management of the estate that followed, treated with a fairness and generosity the Avemery lands had not known in a generation. Lady Vane's fate needed no court to seal it. Society's own memory proved punishment enough. Eloan Avemery did not remarry quickly, and when she finally did, some years later, it surprised no one at all that the man she married was Alaric Penrose, who had loved her, it turned out, since they were children racing ponies across a Kentish field, and who had never once in all the years between required her to be anything other than exactly who she was in order to earn that love. She wore the reforged tiara to that second wedding, the phoenix catching the light exactly as it had on the night of her first true victory, and she told the story often, in later years, to her own daughters, not as a tale of a husband's betrayal, but as a tale of what a woman discovers she is capable of once she stops waiting to be rescued and simply begins, quietly and methodically, to rescue herself. The old tiara, she liked to say, had been made to adorn whichever woman a duke happened to choose. The new one had been made by a duchess who chose, at last, herself, Avemery Hall. Under her sole direction in the years that followed, prospered in a manner it had not known in living memory, its tenants no longer cheated of their rents, its accounts kept with the same scrupulous honesty Eloan had once applied only to her own private ledger of grievances. Mrs. Fenwick lived to a very great age in the housekeeper's rooms she had occupied for 4 decades, proud, she said often, to have served under the one mistress of the house who had ever truly deserved her loyalty. Peters the clerk was given a partnership he had never dared hope for in the firm that had once employed him only to keep his silence. And on quiet evenings, when her daughters asked to hear the story again, Eloan would take down the reforged tiara from its case and let them trace the phoenix with careful fingers. And she would tell them every time that the most important thing their mother had ever learned was not how to catch a husband in a lie, but how to stop waiting for permission to be angry about it, and that a woman who has been handed nothing but silence for long enough owes it to herself, eventually, to answer with something considerably louder.